All right, everyone, here we are with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. Today, we have Olie with us. Olie was born in south of England and spent his childhood outdoors playing in and around boats. At the age of 18, he spent 6 months in Central America working on a conservation project, helping to rebuild a remote ranger station and teaching in a local school. The experience gave him an appetite for adventure, travel, to see the world, and to understand more about different people and cultures. His two biggest adventures to date were the Amazon River Run, kayaking 6,500 kilometers from source to sea on the Amazon River. And recently, Olie completed a 4,500 kilometer walk through India. On both journeys, we were able to connect with Olie several times from the field, and you can check out those events on our YouTube page. So I just want to thank you, Olie, for coming out. And I'm sorry your video doesn't work, but we'll do this with audio.
Yeah, thanks very much, guys. It's a pleasure to be here and chatting again. I know it's been probably almost a year since the last time I connected with a classroom, so it's good to be back.
Wonderful, thank you.
Oh, is it working?
Yeah, it's working. You can go ahead.
Cool, yeah. So I guess when Joe reached out to me, he sort of wanted me to talk about kind of, 2019 ambitions and trying to set up a year of adventure and setting goals and how you can be resilient. And just kind of integrating that a bit more into your daily life. So, I mean, I've just been, over the last couple of weeks, January tends to be a period where I'm just trying to figure out what I'm going to be trying to do over the next year. So I'm kind of going through that process at the moment. But for me, 2018 was quite a big year. Obviously, I did the journey through India in 2017. So just to recap on that, I walked from the very top of India to the very bottom. And while I was walking, I was trying to learn more about the history of India and how the struggle for independence actually affected people on the ground. And it was a fascinating journey. It took me 7.5 months to walk 4,500 kilometers. And so I basically came back from that really energized. I had this ambition of making a film, and I spent most of 2018 doing that. A lot of the UK had like these big heat waves. In fact, a lot of the northern hemisphere had huge heat waves, and so I was trying to work through that, and that had its own challenges of just being kind of stuck inside a bit. But in August, I released my film to a film festival. It's now a long documentary about that journey and some of the things, the encounters I had, the people I met, and really trying to communicate the history of what I learned while I was out in India. I've since gone back to a desk job. I work in digital advertising, so it's kind of a way I know that I can earn some money to kind of and spend some time planning my next journey, my next adventure. And so I started that in the middle of November. And so at the moment, yeah, my 2019 has just been turning up to work and trying to earn some money and really trying to think about what I want to achieve in 2019. And for me, there are kind of 3 areas I think that I'm going to focus on. So one is just getting back into the working routine. I've had 2 years out for the India project. So it's quite nice to actually be based in one place and getting back into a bit of a routine, getting my fitness up again, and catching up with friends and family, because that's also incredibly important for me. The next is really trying to push my film out there into different channels. So currently the film's going to a number of film festivals, none in the USA and Canada at the moment, but hopefully fairly soon my film will be accepted into one of the big festivals over there, which would be great. might even give me the opportunity to come to the North US and kind of, you know, experience a bit of your culture as well. But I'm also doing some private screenings with adventure groups and in schools to really try and reach a much broader audience with my film. I'm doing talks in schools as well. So again, trying to share the stories and experiences that I had in a slightly different way, and maximizing, you know, all that effort that I put in last year to get the most out of the film, the final product, as it were. And then in terms of adventure for 2019, for me, it's going to be very much based in the UK. As I said, like, you know, India was a 2-year project for me, so I need to kind of, you know, earn some money, not spend too much. And the UK is like a fantastic place to do that. You know, there are so many places on my doorstep pretty much that I've not spent time exploring, and you know, so it allows me to have maybe many more shorter little adventures and challenges this year, which would be great. And I've got ideas about walking across the north, sort of, we've got this dividing wall between Scotland and England, which is called Hadrian's Wall. So I'd love to be able to walk from one coast to another. Again, learning about the history of that, you know, and just generally spending more time outdoors. Another thing I want to do is try and fit in more micro adventures into my working week. So a micro adventure is something where you maybe straight after work, I will head off to a train station. I'll catch a train maybe an hour, 45 minutes out of London, and go and find a forest or a park or somewhere just to have a little adventure, just, you know, spend some time out in the wild, disconnect from all the screens and technology and everything, and just, you know, go out with a couple of mates, find a pub somewhere to have some food, and then go and find a place to sleep, and then get back in time for work in the next morning. So, you know, adventure doesn't have to be a huge thing, a huge challenge. It could just be taking time out of your normal routine, or just pushing yourself in a slightly different way. And that's really what I'm gonna be focusing on this year. So yeah, that's kind of what I have planned. You know, I always like to try and take risks and push myself in different directions. I think making a film in 2017 was really doing that. It was giving me a new skill, something I'd never done before. And that was a big challenge that I was kind of excited, but a little bit apprehensive as to how it would actually turn out. And, you know, when you're so close to a project, it becomes, well, you just don't know whether you've kind of become numb to what you're kind of creating, and whether, you know, from an outsider perspective, whether you're doing what you're doing is actually correct or the right sort of thing to be doing. So, yeah. But I would love to hear some ideas that you guys have for your own challenges, you know, setting your own goals, taking risks. And if there's any way I can kind of help and encourage you to do that, then absolutely, I'd love to hear those and be able to share some kind of advice and stories and so on. One thing I just noticed in just reported over here in the UK was that there was kind of a Canadian who's just become the youngest person to cycle around the world. He set off when he was 17, so he literally just left school, and it's taken him about 7.5 months. And so I think that's a really positive story, and it really goes to demonstrate, you know, if you set your mind to doing something, you know, he set off straight after school, so he'd got his qualifications that he needed and so on, and then he went off and did something that he was really passionate about, you know, and he must have had an incredible time while doing that, amazing experiences that, you know, a lot of 17, 18-year-olds will never have had. So I think that just demonstrates, you know, anything is kind of possible when you set your mind to it. But yeah, should we go to some classrooms and hear some thoughts about what you guys have planned for 2019, where you want to be taking risks and setting yourself some goals, that sort of thing. And obviously any questions about India or the Amazon journey that I did in 2015, then I'm happy to answer those as well.
Wonderful. Let's go see about Mrs. Hines' class. This is in Freehold, New Jersey. Does any of you have a question for Olie or something you want to ask him? Mrs. Hines' class, and do you guys have any questions? Okay, I'll hang on for now. If you have one, just send it in the chat, and then I'll let you know. How about let's see here. This class here, we've got. It's hard for me to see the name. Does one of you have a question for Olie? This would be. I guess this is Katie's class. Oh, there you go. I see you coming up. Yeah, there we are.
There we go.
Hi. Oh, we don't hear you on the microphone. I think you just need to turn it on. Just at the top. Wonderful. Oh, no, it's off again.
There we go.
It clicks on and off. Want to try it again? Well, we'll come back. It looks like if you could maybe type the question in the chat. We have one question here that came in through the chat. It says, we are studying about the UN Sustainable Goals, Sustainable Development Goals. Is it hard to get water when you're in India?
That's a really great question, and I think the UN Sustainability Goals are a really ambitious project that they've got going on, but I equally think it's incredibly important. You know, the world at the moment is going through a really weird phase of in terms of environment and climate and so on, and people are reacting in different ways. In terms of India specifically, it wasn't difficult to get water. It was, you know, every half day I'd be going through a little village or something like that, maybe more frequently, you know, and I made sure that I had enough water for the particular part of the journey that I was on, you know, and I would spot communities coming up in the kind of in the distance. And so, yeah, I would be able to get hold of water relatively easily. That said, India at the moment is going through a really tricky period where there is just not enough water to go around. And you see that particularly in the big cities like Delhi and Mumbai and Bangalore, where they have, you know, there are going to be restrictions in terms of water use. I think it's predicted that within the next sort of 2 years or so, India may well run out of water, which is going to be a huge, huge problem. But yeah, while I was traveling, there were a lot of, you know, I would walk into a village and I would ask someone, is there somewhere I can get some water? Or there would be a little hand pump on the side of the road where I could then fill up my water bottle. I took these amazing water bottles. It's called Water to Go. And they've got these little filters in, so you can fill your water bottle up from any water source, and there is no the filter itself filters out any bugs or bacteria or anything that's really going to cause you any damage or harm. So these filters meant that I could actually fill up water from anywhere I wanted, whether it was a stream or a puddle or from one of these water pumps. So yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That was a great question. That was from Mrs. Painter's class in Salem, Virginia. Now we have a Mrs. Brown's class in Sterling, Virginia, they had a question for you. They said, who did you meet when you were in India?
Another really good question. I met so many people, many different religions. So in the very north of the country, there were predominantly Buddhist people that I was meeting. They're much more sort of quiet, calm, and thoughtful. They are incredibly quiet, calm, and thoughtful. As I progressed further south, the religion changed to Hinduism and Sikhism and Muslims, and so it gave me a real sense of what made up the nation of India. Everybody, without exception, was incredibly friendly and welcoming. You know, wherever I walked into a village, I would just start chatting to people. People would come up to me and try to find out what I was doing or why I was there. And so, yeah, that was it was great meeting so many varied people, whether they were, of an affluent background, whether they were what Gandhi termed as the untouchables. So the sort of the lowest caste within their society over there. And I had a lot of fun with anyone. In particular, I was trying to meet people that were over the age of sort of 75 or 80, that they actually experienced that period of history. And so, yeah, I did manage to come across maybe 15 people or so of that sort of age, which is brilliant.
Wonderful. We have a question from Mrs. Hines' class. This is in Freehold, New Jersey, and students would like to know where you plan to go next and what was the most difficult part of your Amazon River run?
Oh, wow. The most difficult part of the Amazon River run, and thanks for doing the research, looking at that journey. It was a really exciting challenge, very dangerous in parts. Because of the environment that we were traveling through, the fact that it was only Taryn and myself, completely self-supported. We had everything we needed or thought we needed, but in the jungle environment, you're a long way from kind of connection and being able to get any sort of help other than the local communities that are along the edge of the river. I would say there were two tricky parts to the Amazon journey. The first was really around pirates. So we were warned a number of times about the threat of pirates, people coming down from Colombia into Brazil, or they were coming up the river from the river mouth, and they hide out in the mangroves down there, and they come up the river mouth and they try and see any, they try and take advantage of anything that's traveling down the river, whether that's people or whether it's cargo ships. And I actually saw a cargo ship being robbed by a small group, maybe 6 people. They climbed onto the boat and they ran around the boat with guns, asking the crew for things like mobile phones and other electronics. And that was pretty crazy to see, but also quite worrying that we were quite so close to it. Now, luckily, we had no issues with pirates or anything like that. We didn't have any encounters, but yeah, it was a really kind of, I was very conscious about the dangers we were in. The second was wildlife, and about 3/4 of the way along, I was just filling up my water bottle in the river, and something shot into the side of my foot, and my whole leg went numb. Because the water was really murky and it was quite dark, it was just about kind of coming up to sunrise. So I hadn't seen what this was, but slowly my leg started going numb, and the further this poison worked its way up my leg. And it was terrifying because, as I said, we were in such a remote environment that I knew there was no help anywhere near us. In fact, the nearest villages were about 50 kilometers away. And so whatever was going to happen, I kind of let it had to take its own course and try and control the situation as best I could. So I took some antihistamines, and they help try and neutralize any kind of poison or allergic reaction that you have. And I boiled up some hot water as well. And stuck my foot in the hottest water I could possibly bear. It might sound incredibly painful, but actually it was less painful than the sting itself. And the idea of that is it just tries and draws out the poison from the wound. So yeah, two very exciting and sort of tricky parts of the journey down the Amazon.
Wow, sounds incredible. It looks like we have a question from Ms. Kizyar's class in Milton. Do you have your question ready?
Yes, sir. What inspired you to want to travel?
What inspired me to want to travel? It's a very good question. For me, it's all about the different cultures and communities that I get to interact with. So by that, you know, when I travel, I want to go and meet as many people as possible from the area that I'm traveling through. I want to find out what it's like to live in that kind of environment. You know, it's so different to how I live here in the UK, but you guys probably live in Canada or the States. And so it's trying to draw comparisons between the way I live and the way they live, but also look at some of the tricky situations that they have to go through for things like accessing water, getting clean water so that they can drink or cook. So it's, yeah, for me, it's very much about the culture and community. I went on my first journey when I was 18, and I went to Belize, which is in Central America, just below Mexico on the Caribbean coast. And I really loved the different kind of environment that I was in there. It was a tropical jungle environment. I was living with a family in a little village, and I was helping out in a school. I was teaching English there, but also helping out with sports and science and other things. And by living in the community, it gave me a real insight into how people live in that area and how they utilize the forest for access to different kinds of foods and where they were farming and so on. So it was a really interesting insight for me, and that has continued to drive my passion for traveling.
Wonderful. What about Mrs. Anderson's class in Burlington, Ontario? Do you have a question? Okay, let's turn on your mic here. Let's see here.
There we
go ahead.
Were your travels like rough and hard, like the river, and was like the streams rough?
Was the traveling rough? Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be honest, I don't like staying in a nice luxury hotel. For me, they always feel a bit too sanitized, so a bit too clean. You know, it sort of seems as if it's been set up for the tourists. So I very much like to try and experience a country for, or sort of how the locals experience it and live in it. So yeah, for the Amazon, we were camping on the side of the river, on these little sandbanks, or we were staying within a community. We would put up our tents in the village itself. But for me, yeah, that's the exciting part of traveling, is to live alongside the locals rather than go to sort of big touristy sites and so on.
And what about the rivers and the terrain itself? Was that difficult?
Yeah. So both journeys actually started very high up in the mountains. In the Andes in Peru, it was about 4,500 meters. In India, it was much higher again. It was about 5,500 meters. So one of the biggest challenges you have there is not only the rough terrain that you're going over. So you're going over these huge mountains that they were often covered in, you know, deep snow, and then you go down into a valley and it slightly warms up, but again, the terrain is incredibly rough, trying to get up and over and down the other side of a mountain. The biggest effect on your body is the altitude. So it's like it's really difficult to breathe. It's like breathing through a straw the whole time. There's much less oxygen at those sorts of altitudes, and so you're really trying to breathe as much as you can. And quite often people suffer a lot of dizziness when they go up to altitude, and they really struggle. They find they can't control their legs or their actions, and I think that's a really tough thing to have to kind of deal with. But slowly over time, you get more and more used to living at that altitude, which is why, you know, the locals are able to live up there with no problems at all, and they are incredibly fit because they're going up and over this sort of terrain very frequently. Once I got out of the Himalayas in India, it was dead flat. There was no texture in the landscape. There was no mountains or hills or anything like that. That added so the terrain was very straightforward and easy, but that actually added another dimension to the journey, because mentally it was much, much harder than I'd anticipated. There was nothing for me on the horizon that I could see in the distance to aim for. And so it meant that I was constantly questioning whether I was doing enough walking each day. I didn't really know how far I'd gone each day. And so it was a real mental battle to try and keep on moving and not stop or slow down.
Great. There's a question from Mrs. Elliott's class in Dallas, Texas. Do you have your question ready?
Yes. Whenever you travel, how much do you study before you go about a culture so that you're respectful? And how hard is it when you don't know the language or directions?
Great questions there. In terms of the preparation before I go, I try and do some level of research so that I'm culturally respectful. You know, I look at the religions that are in the country. You know, I try and find some films on YouTube or something that allows me to kind of connect or understand a bit more about the culture, the history, maybe the politics as well. Politics is a really tricky one because a lot of people get very passionate about politics, but it can become quite personal as well. So it's always a tricky subject to try and broach. But certainly for India, I did a lot of research about the history, trying to make sure I knew as much as I could before I arrived in the country, and could then start asking questions. And that just gave me a base level of knowledge. For the Amazon, it wasn't quite so much about the culture. It was more about the journey through the remote environment. So I did, you know, far less research there. Language-wise, it's very tricky. India actually speak English as their second language. So often in the small villages that I was passing through, there were always kids that could speak English. And so I was, and there was normally someone else around that could speak a reasonable level of English, that I could have a good conversation with them and get more from living with them or sort of being with them. You know, I could find out a lot more information. But I've never actively kind of learned a language for one of my journeys. I think in the UK, certainly, we can be quite lazy around trying to learn another language in order to get more from the conversations you have. But absolutely, I think, you know, the more you know and understand about a culture, the more you're going to understand how it works, but also how you'll be able to get deeper into conversations and challenge them or question them in different ways and draw those comparisons that I was talking about.
Great. We have, let's see here. Mrs. Maxwell, does your class have a question for Olie?
Yeah. Anybody else have any questions who want to get taken?
Okay, I see you there.
Stuff going to Amazon, traveling through India, about micro adventures.
Let's see here.
Go ahead, ask your question too.
Okay. Do you have a question? I see you on the camera there. Yeah.
Oh, when you were going, did you ever like run out of resources like food or water, like in between villages?
Did I ever run out of food or water or resources between villages and places I was stopping? In India, there were a few times where I ran very, very low on water. And I hadn't really anticipated it, but I was following the railway line and the temperature outside was extremely hot. It was about 48 degrees Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but it's incredibly hot. And I'd planned that I was going to be able to, I knew that along the edge of the railway, you obviously get the railway stations. And in each railway station, there was generally a tap for water. And I'd gone a certain distance and I got to the railway station and none of the taps at that railway station were working. And I knew that the next railway station was a little bit further than I would have liked. So by the time I got to that next railway station, and as I said, it was extremely hot and there was no shade walking next to the railway. I got to the next railway station and these young guys came up to me, obviously wanting to have a conversation and try and work out what I was doing there and so on. And I could not speak to them. I just had to, I made a beeline for the shade and I wouldn't speak to anyone until I'd got to the shade. I'd sat down and I'd had a good couple of minutes before I could even speak. And that for me really made me realize some of the dangers that I sort of put myself in and how reliant I was on the communities that I was walking through. But no, I've never actually physically run out of, I never ran out of food in India. In fact, I never ran out of food along the edge of the Amazon either. I guess a similar thing happened at the end of the Amazon. The river turns to salt water, which means you can't drink it. And we were using the same water bottles that I took through India. They filter out any of the bugs and sediment in the river. But obviously when the river's salty, it can't filter out the salt. So we got to the end of the river and we'd planned for about 3 days of water that we were carrying, fresh water. But the last day was, we got stuck trying to paddle against the tide. And so we actually had to pull up against the mangroves and hold on to the mangrove trees for a 6-hour period while the tide came in and then went back out again. And, you know, we'd only planned on a certain amount of water. And so that last day we were really struggling. We were really low on fresh water. And I tried to make some food with the salt water that was in from the river. And it was just totally inedible. There was no way that I could drink that water or eat that food. So again, I'd got down to the very last dregs of the bottom of my bottle. I think that probably says something about my planning. I maybe need to think a little bit more about how I consume water and trying to maybe moderate that if I know that there are going to be limitations in terms of access to new clean water.
Great. Well, it looks like we have a couple more questions from Mrs. Anderson's class. One of the questions they had was, and a few other classes as well, they say, with the weather, did you face any natural disasters?
Weather-wise, no, not along the Amazon. In India, it was funny. I walked through the monsoon and I was expecting rain every single day. I'd heard stories about how wet India can get during the monsoon and how awful it can be. And the monsoon goes for about 3 months. But I was walking through a desert area at the time. And so for me, the monsoon didn't feel quite as intense as I was expecting. I'd have maybe 4 days of constant rain, and then it would dry off for about 2 weeks before the next batch of kind of constant rain. And certainly the people in the communities that I was traveling through and past said that the monsoon, in 2017, the year that I did the India journey was different to previous years. It had arrived a little bit later. I think it left a little bit earlier. So it was sort of changing based on what I would say it was changing based on climate change. The only natural disaster that I actually experienced was as I was reaching Kanyakumari, the southern tip of India. A cyclone hit the southern tip of India at the same time, and I was about a week out. And suddenly I heard all these news reports, and I noticed the weather had got particularly bad. It was incredibly windy and very wet. And I'd heard news reports about where the cyclone had hit the southern tip of India, and that was exactly where I was going. So actually, by the time I got there a week later, they'd had school closures, they'd had road closures. There were loads of trees that had been knocked down and blocked up roads and things. And they were just sort of trying to get back into the groove and tidy things up as I arrived at the southern tip. But yeah, luckily I didn't get caught in the middle of that, because I think it would have caused me a lot of problems, and I may have even been delayed, had to kind of hole up in a village or something when that hit.
Wonderful. There's a question from Mrs. Elliott's class that they were wondering about what was your biggest fear when traveling, and how did you overcome it? This was from Danny or Daniel from that class.
In India, I generally thought, well, it took me a little while to get comfortable with it. I thought being a British guy walking through India, asking some questions about their independence from Britain, I was a bit uncertain as to how I would be received. I just got this feeling that maybe people would resent me being British, coming and asking these questions. In reality, people were incredibly open, very friendly about it, and they were equally as interested in me as I was with them. I guess the only other kind of situation that arose was I was walking down a road, and it was between two military bases, and I'd asked some local people how, whether I could get to the main highway on if I went down this road, and they said, yeah, absolutely, pointed in the right direction. And I walked down there, and there were, local people going up and down that little road. And all of a sudden, a guy popped up with a gun, and he just pointed it straight in my face and started screaming and shouting. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I froze, and I was literally there for about half an hour before they found someone that could speak decent level of English. And so I had this conversation, and it turns out that although I was, I had the right documentation to be in the country, they said this road was restricted, and being foreign, I was not allowed down this road. So I got taken in for questioning and an interview and so on. So that was it was a pretty terrifying moment. But I think it was just kind of a misunderstanding, really. And equally, they were doing their job to make sure that, there were no terrorists or spies or anything like that near the military base.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, I wanted to say thank you very much, Olie, for sharing these experiences with us. Maybe if you can leave us with one last piece of advice for someone who's in middle school and elementary school and thinking about having an adventure. What's the next step they should take?
I think just look at when you might be able to take off a little bit of time to do a journey or to have an adventure yourself. And these things don't take a huge amount of time or effort. And as I said right at the beginning, you don't necessarily need to, your big adventure doesn't necessarily need to be, walking across the whole country or anything like that. It could be small, something like walking the length of a river over the course of the summer holidays, which you could do on a weekend, stages on a weekend. So try and come up with your idea that sounds interesting. If it's got a purpose behind it, that's kind of even better. So by purpose, I mean, trying to discover something, how you might be able to share the story, your story of what you're learning along the way. And to really actually get started, the best thing to do is write a list and to say, right, how am I going to get myself from this point here in time to the start line? And so for India, I looked at flights. I knew I had to get a flight out to India. So I looked at some dates that would work. I had to get a visa. So I looked at how much it was going to cost me to get a visa, and how long that process would take. I looked at the climate I was going to be walking through, which then helped me identify what kind of clothing I needed, or what kind of where I could sleep at nighttime, all of those sorts of things. So slowly but surely, you can build out a list, and it doesn't need to be definitive. That list will evolve over time, and slowly but surely, you can tick each of those off one at a time. And your big idea of walking the length of a river actually has been broken down into much smaller chunks, which are much more manageable. So that would be my advice, really, is just start with an idea, a little seed, a little thought, and try and figure out how you can get from now to the start line. And off the back of that, I'm sure your plans will evolve, and you'll be able to actually do the journey, the adventure that you want to.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to put everyone's mic on, so I want them all to say a big thank you to you for coming and sharing with you your experience. So I think everyone's mic now, so you can all say thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, guys. I wish you the best of luck for 2019. I'd love to hear anything you've got, any stories, any journeys, any adventures you're doing. Do send me an email or message on social media, and if I can help in any way I can, then
Wonderful. Let's see. Thank you very much, Olie. This has been Olie Hunter Smart with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. He shared with us some amazing experiences of his journeys across the Amazon and India, and some of the new adventures he's going to be doing soon. So feel free to follow him and on social media and on his website. And thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.